from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. Welcome to Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. I'm gonna talk about a few topics. I'm gonna try and explain some things. They've all been in the news. If I was gonna narrow down to one topic for this episode, I was going to basically just focus on the peace agreement, or the phase one agreement, the ceasefire in Gaza, if you will. That's such huge news. We live in, dare I say, very interesting times. And to paraphrase a word I heard from the White House recently, I'm going to do a little clarification, if you will, as far as where things are, because I've heard a lot of things thrown out there. So let's talk about the peace deal in Gaza. That was a big deal middle of this last week, Wednesday. That message get passed from Secretary Rubio to President Trump while he's in a televised meeting in the White House, roundtable meeting, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, they're sending out a Truth Social post saying that the parties have come to an agreement, and that was the beginning of what has become certainly a ceasefire. And all hyperbole aside, phase one of what everyone hopes will be a larger peace agreement that basically ends, I would say, everything since 1947 regarding the fate of the Palestinians and the territories that that could eventually become a state of Palestine. So that's basically what was being put out there. Not saying they got an agreement to create a state of Palestine, way far away from that. And the U.S. and Israel both said that they're not in any way ready for something like that. But they do have an agreement to start a ceasefire, which is starting, and to release the Israeli hostages, both living and deceased, and they're going to release a number of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. So this is a big deal. It is the phase one deal, though, and there's more phases to this, all right? Now, they should see the release of the living hostages and hopefully all the deceased hostages. Little question on that last one. It looks like they may be setting up an international task force to track down the remains of some of the hostages that maybe Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, others could not find to return. That's to be seen. I think that's what's driving them to say, look, let's wait till Monday before we start doing hostage exchange, or hostage releases in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. And so we'll see if they can get all the deceased hostages out as well. The deal also has Israel not withdrawing from the Gaza Strip, but withdrawing from a very large chunk of the Gaza Strip back to what is on some graphics depicted as a yellow line, where the Israeli Defense Forces would only control about 53%, which is significant, still more than half, of the Gaza Strip. And then further withdrawals will be later worked out. But there has to be a peacekeeping force that goes in there. There has to be some sort of governing entity that actually runs the place, that keeps things going, that starts repairs, starts making things like water happen, and sewage systems start to work, water systems start to work. All the necessities of life start to come back together. And there has to be a phenomenal amount of reconstruction that takes place. So all of this has to happen. The deal kind of starts Friday morning their time, but it has been approved by the Israeli cabinet, so it has Israeli government approval on this, and so we should see all the release of the hostages within. They have a 72-hour thing when it starts, and 72 hours that would be, they should see the release of the hostages start by then. I don't know if they'll be completely finished. Hopefully they will, but at least it'll be started by then. Phase one is also a ceasefire, which allows for a rapid increase in aid coming in, but securely getting that aid to those who need it in Palestine is still going to be a problem. Beyond Hamas ripping off aid trucks and PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad ripping off aid trucks, there's a lot of criminal organizations that rip off the aid and resell it on the black market for a tidy sum. That's how they make money. In a place that's completely destroyed, people are pretty desperate, and the criminals tend to be even more desperate, so they will do anything to keep going. And so getting that aid securely into those who need it is still going to be problematic. And frankly, if you're having to fight off armed criminals, you may have some armed confrontations. So there's a lot of things to be worked out there. All right. Now, the next part of the negotiation is phase 2, phase 3. This is more difficult. This is where the goal is to disarm, demilitarize Hamas and the other groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and that they will not be part of the governing process of Gaza going forward. It's still being worked out as to what that interim governing thing will be. President Trump had put out something that Israel had agreed to, which was putting together some sort of commission or something that would be an interim governing thing. Trump would be the head of the commission. Tony Blair would also play a prominent role there, the former Israeli prime minister. But then there's a lot of pushback on that, which is, okay, so now you've got this U.S. and European governing thing for the Middle East. And of course, look, it was a long time ago, but no one has forgotten the European colonial legacy in the Middle East. So no one's really, particularly the British colonial legacy in what's now Israel and the Palestinian territory. So there's a lot of things there that still have to be worked out. Now, the U.S. has pledged just recently, like in the last few hours when I'm reporting this, that they're going to send in 200 troops to run what's called a civil military coordination center. Now, some of you may know that I actually trained foreign militaries on how to set up things like civil military coordination centers and civil military operation centers. And that is something that the U.S. does very well. We do these types of operations all over the world, have been for decades to decades. So I'm not surprised to see that. The White House came out with a clarification that these troops were not actually going into what appears to be into Gaza. They weren't actually going to be boots on the ground in Gaza. Some of the stuff that was said about them kind of inferred that. And I think somebody needs to go back to the School of Strategic Communications. When you start saying that they're going to be there to help enforce the peace or enforce whatever's going on, that is the wrong language for what you have these guys doing. They're in there to help coordinate, manage, to get aid in there, to get peacekeeping forces in there, to do a lot of things, but they're not actually there as boots on the ground enforcing stuff. Could phase 1 be complete and phase 2 never get agreed to? That's a very real possibility. I think that's something that everybody's got to kind of have in the back of their minds. You know, despite all the hope, the best wishes, all the ceremonies and the flowery words about what this poses for the future, there may be a situation here where Hamas and PIJ just cannot face their existential end, if you will, that they cannot surrender their arms, that they cannot give up being a governing part of the Gaza Strip. And it could be a thing where even if the negotiators out of Doha and Qatar agree to it, that the rank and file Hamas members or small units that are in Gaza may not agree to it. And some of them, I'm sure some of them would rather die, if you will, than to surrender. So we have to be recognized that's a very, very real possibility. Hamas is already trying to bifurcate the surrender of arms. You know, say, well, we'll give you certain arms. We'll give you the longer range things, like maybe the missiles and stuff like that. But we're going to keep all of our small arms, all right, the stuff that we carry on us. Well, that doesn't disarm Hamas. They're still very much an armed organization. And I can't see a situation where that would really be satisfying to anybody, but certainly not to Israel. So I could see that whole thing breaking down there. Also, Israel, as this war has gone on, has been basically making allies within the Gaza Strip as they've uncovered territory. There are families, clans, groups that are naturally occurring that are very powerful. Some of them are tied to criminal activity, but they oppose Hamas. And historically, they've always kind of opposed Hamas. And Israel's been using them, leveraging them for their best advantage. So they will be there, and they do not want to get pushed aside either. They want to come out of this thing doing well, too. So there's a lot of internal things within Gaza that are going to have to be taken out. So this is big. This is, this could pave the road to eventually a genuine Middle East peace. You know, something where the fate of the Palestinians is finally worked out that there are sovereign, potentially sometime way in the future, sovereign Palestinian territories or lands, a nation state, if you will, that they could call their own. That's very possible. But this whole thing could just simply disappear too. This could get through phase one and then just literally fall apart, and we're back to where we were, and it turns into a very bloody, difficult military campaign. So we'll see. Now, switching gears, a judge in Chicago today issued a temporary restraining order blocking the deployment of National Guard troops in Illinois, basically going to Chicago to guard federal facilities and provide security for federal personnel, federal law enforcement like ICE agents in Chicago. And the judge said the Trump directive violates the Constitution and would only add fuel to the fire that the judge felt that the White House themselves had basically started. All right. Now, in handing down this order, she also ripped the Department of Homeland Security's factual accounts of what's been going on and what its agents have been encountering, and cited judicial sightings in other cases over the past 2 days that the agency has been fairly unreliable and is providing unreliable evidence, if you will. And when I look at this, I was kind of looking through it, and there's a lot of problems. I don't know what happened with the U.S. Department of Justice on this, all right? But basically, the judge had significant doubts on DHS's credibility with what's going on, and frankly was really irritated that the federal lawyers in the case couldn't even answer some basic questions, some of which were basically definitional. What does that term really mean? They couldn't define it. I think the concept of, can the president federalize National Guard? Absolutely. I don't think the Supreme Court or any of the appellate courts are going to disagree that the president cannot federalize the National Guard. Can the president deploy National Guard within the nation to federal property? I don't think that's something that will prevail as it moves up the court ladder. I think the appellate and certainly the Supreme Court will turn around and say, yeah, you can federalize the National Guard, put them into Title X federal status, and send them to a federal building in downtown Chicago and use them for security at that building. I don't see that as being an issue. I think some of the rhetoric around this is like they're going to go in there and crush crime or deal with crime on the streets of Chicago and all that stuff. That's a whole different, when you say stuff like that, you kind of muddy you look at the orders that they were given, but then when someone says things like that, I can see where it creates a rhetorical problem. The other issue too is when you have a cabinet member or the president or the vice president saying things along those lines, got to remember, they are in the chain of command. So when they say things like that, judges may say, okay, this is what you said. You are in the chain of command. Despite what you have written in your orders, despite what you tell me, that's not what you said. And you are in the chain of command. And you said they're going to go in there to do this. And that was one of the things that the judges, more than this judge, have cited is some of the rhetoric that's out there. And I kind of think somebody's going to have to do a check on that at some point, or they're just going to have more legal issues that come out of this. All right. It was an hours-long hearing that this took place. Now, on the other side, you've probably heard me talk about the order that took place in Oregon that first stopped the Oregon National Guard from deploying into Portland, particularly in South Portland at the ICE facility down there. And then when it looked like President Trump was going to federalize California, take the federalized California National Guard troops and maybe Texas National Guard troops and send them up to Oregon, as Oregon National Guard couldn't under this order, then Gavin Newsom had California join with Oregon and also joined with that temporary stay. And so California and in that order, no National Guard troops from the other states could come in, which I thought was kind of interesting. Now, again, there was a lot of charged rhetoric talking about how Portland is in a horrible situation. It's a battle zone. I don't know if they said battle zone, but they basically made Portland sound like it's a very, very bad situation. And honestly, Portland has had problems. Don't get me wrong. But they were going up there again, putting in federal status to guard federal facilities. Now, for the first time, President Trump has talked about invoking the Insurrection Act. I will say if there's no federal troops actually in these cities, You can invoke the Insurrection Act all you want, but there's no federal troops to actually do anything about the Insurrection Act. And certainly if the president invokes the Insurrection Act, I imagine that people will be clamoring to the nearest federal courthouse to see whether, to say that the president didn't have the predicate to do so. And there'll be a very interesting legal debate on that. But I will say this, there's a danger. Chicago has kind of opened the door on some things by saying we're going to obstruct federal law enforcement in Chicago streets. That recording of the chief of patrol of Chicago PD saying that they were a slow roll response to help federal agents that were out there, protecting these facilities or doing immigration enforcement. All of these things are ones where, the lawyers, federal lawyers could turn around and say, look, the state, the city and state is simply refusing to comply with federal laws. And that's one where I think if it goes up to the Supreme Court, certainly it's going to come back to these states to say no. And I want to point out something that a lot of people realize about the National Guard. It is the National Guard. It is a federally funded organization. The Guard members are federally funded. They are paid for by the federal government. Their equipment, everything around them, is paid for by the federal government. The armories where they go in and drill are federally owned property. All right, all this stuff is federally owned. There is this idea that they are state militaries or state militias that the federal government can borrow. That hasn't been true for over a century. In fact, I would say that hasn't been true since probably the turn of the century before the last century, around 1900. The last time that was probably true was the Spanish-American War, because after the Spanish-American War, everybody in the Department of War at that point, all the services turned around and said, this did not work well. Certainly we love the Rough Riders and Teddy Roosevelt, but quietly amongst ourselves, we can't do stuff like this again. We have got to professionalize the military, and we got to professionalize the reserve component. And that was where the reserve component started getting really professionalized, and that was a federally driven thing. So rather than people thinking of them as a state military force that the federal government can borrow, it's actually quite the other way around. If the federal government's not using them, then the government's allowed, or the governor is allowed to use them in that state. But if so, the governor is supposed to pay for them using state funds. And I've talked about Title 32 and the abuse of Title 32, which is federal funding, where it doesn't always take away from the normal chain of command that goes up through the state military department up to the governor. And I think that's something that they're going to have to address at some point. But I do think that at the end of the day, the fact that these are federally funded, federally recognized troops on federal facilities is going to weigh in. And also, if you look back in 1957, Arkansas did not want to enforce racial integration of the school. President Eisenhower sent in the 1st Airborne to enforce that, and they did. All right. In fact, he declared the Insurrection Act because the governor was unwilling to comply with federal law. All right. So that I would say, and that was racial integration of schools, which I would definitely say, if you're talking about enforcement of immigration, that falls certainly definitely in the same specter, same rationale as a justification for looking, in terms of legal justification, in terms of why the White House may be using phrases like talking about the Insurrection Act. So I just want to point that out. There is precedence for all this stuff. Finally, what is happening in Ukraine? Well, Ukraine, there's been a lot of strikes. There's a huge strike as I'm talking right now by Russia into Ukraine. It's causing tremendous damage to their energy infrastructure and a lot of other things. But Ukraine has been doing some really spectacular deep strikes all over Russia. They have these long-distance, deep penetration drones. They have these new Flamingo homegrown cruise missiles with tremendous range comparable to the Tomahawk missiles. And it's very possible that Ukraine may get Tomahawk missiles. There's about 200 missiles that the U.S. Tomahawk missiles, these are the missiles that we used to attack Iran recently. The B-2s hit one site, the Tomahawks hit the other two nuclear sites. These are first-order missiles, very accurate, huge warheads, 1,000-pound warheads, and a tremendous range. With the Tomahawks there, They could hit well east of the Urals. They could probably hit all the way going into what some would say is Siberia. But they could take out refineries, ammunition production facilities, you name it. They could cause phenomenal damage, and Putin knows it, and Putin's nervous as hell about it, because they will also bring the war home to the Russian people in a way that the Russian people simply haven't seen to date. They're very difficult to stop, and if they fire a tomahawk at something, it's got a really, really good chance of hitting wherever that something is, and Russia is nervous about that possibility. So that's what's happening there. And also this much talked about, I talked about it, that this fall would be very decisive. There was like 100 to 150,000 Russian troops getting ready to do this big push in Donetsk. Well, I've seen a lot of attempted offensive actions in Donetsk. They just haven't seemed to make a lot of progress. What I have seen is some of the worst months for Russian losses, troop losses ever in the entire war. Horrific losses that they have taken trying to take territory. And I'm starting to wonder if things aren't so bad on the Russian lines that they may not be able to actually tactically or operationally pull off this big fall offensive. It may be that they've started to try it multiple times and they just couldn't get anywhere. And so they're kind of back trying to rework, re-engineer what they're planning on doing, but they're having a very difficult time. So I'm not quite sure if that thing, it may sputter out. This may be the offense that never really sputtered or never turned into a big offense. And that's the one I was talking about in the Donbass and Donetsk Oblast. It just doesn't seem to be making much. Also, the Russian economy is quickly collapsing. And unless something dramatically changes, it's going to probably collapse in 2026. That's been predicted, by the way, going back at least 2 years. They've been talking about that. They're running out of their sovereign wealth fund. And also, Russia has started to rely more on doing what we call hybrid warfare, gray area attacks in Europe. And it appears they've been using these shadow tankers, these dilapidated tankers they use to ship oil to various countries, as drone platforms. The drone platforms have been flying around airports, shutting down air traffic, just very, very disruptive stuff, along with sabotage, like ripping up fiber optic cables under the Baltic Sea. Long story short, we're starting to see enforcement action on these shadow tankers. And if the shadow tanker fleet is dramatically curtailed because of these, I would consider immature sabotage activities that Russia's doing, that's going to put even more pressure economically on Putin because he won't have that revenue coming in. Anyway, we live in interesting times. There's a lot to know and consider. I just wanted to go through these things because there's a lot of stuff that's coming fast and furious, and I just wanted to clarify some of these things. Hey, thanks for listening to STRAT. We've talked about a lot of strategic risk issues. This is shaping our globe in ways that sometimes we may not even realize, and it's shaping the global economy. Please visit stratpodcast.com. Also, you can go to my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV, or you can go to my corporate website at www.gripsa, that's for Global Risk Intelligence and Planning, SA, or gripsa.com. And hopefully you'll find this interesting and you'll listen to the next one, and I appreciate your time.